I want to call out a couple people in the room. You know, I'm very bullish on the future of Denmark for a couple key reasons. First off, I look around the room and I see entrepreneurs like Jonas and Martin and Tia and Rasmus and all of you that I've just loved working with. But I also want to call out two of my students who I think are the next generation. So Anders Valentin, can you stand up, Anders? And Martin Collington. So these guys are at CBS. This is an embarrassment of riches. This is what Denmark can do, right? These two young men just have been all around the world, finishing their studies at CBS. You guys tell us where you've been. So they've traveled on 3 continents, finishing up their undergraduate degree at Chinese University of Hong Kong, CBS, and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I am a professor. And, you know, this is where the proof comes to the proof point, right? So, Martin, where are you working right now? These two guys are the next generation. You know, they represent a generation that's coming up that I think is very serious about entrepreneurship. The other reason I'm bullish about entrepreneurship in Denmark is the EL2 project, and I'll tell you why. There is just an infectious curiosity to what's happening. And while you could point to 1 million accelerators and 15 different types of programs worldwide who are attempting to understand the science of startups, this is the only one that fuses a research program with an actual entrepreneur-driven learning process. And for that reason, I think we have the opportunity to learn something that no one else has. I haven't seen that fusion, and I travel all over the world. I know Sarah's has too. That fuses these two perspectives in one. So I'm very excited about that possibility. One of the curiosities, and you know, I guess I'm a student of Peter Torstensen in a lot of ways because he's infectious. I don't know if you spent time with Peter, but he infects you with ideas. And I got excited about an idea that I wasn't, you know, I got to tell you, I've been lean to death. I've been around talking about lean startup for the last few years, and you know, what we haven't done is determine whether or not what we're doing is working, right? So that's what we need to get serious about. One of the thoughts we had was with the last session that was done in Accelerace, that we would go ahead and study whether or not what we're teaching works. And the first crack at that was a project that Peter and I discussed, the possibility of looking at how business models are framed and whether or not the current conceptualization of a business model is actually, sufficient to understand the real phenomena. So let me just give you a sense. This was a case study type of model. We were looking specifically at how people developed initial business models and used a traditional tool. Alex Osterwalder, who's a fantastic person who did co-create the business model canvas, came up with a conceptual tool called the business model canvas that entrepreneurs are using now to try to understand the logic of the firm and understand how it relates to revenue and cost. Well, we taught on that last time. And we studied how entrepreneurs used it as a way to bring together their sense of business models. And then we evaluated where it was strong and where it was deficient, with the idea that we might be able to adapt and co-create something new. So there you go. If you know Lean Startup, in Steve Blank's world, the business model is a central element to this, and it's about a process of validating a customer need and ultimately conveying how a business is operating in the market. The notion is that because it's an iteration process, there's learning that goes on, just as Peter had mentioned, and that learning adapts to an understanding of how to go to market ultimately. The concept behind Alex Osterwalder's canvas is you have elements to the right, which are value delivery mechanisms, the customer relationships, the client segments, and the distribution channels that lead to revenue. And then on the left, the key activities, partner network, and key resources which drive cost, all oriented around the value proposition. These are concepts that I believe in, because I do believe the value proposition is a critical element to understanding this. But I wanted to understand whether or not this as a framework was effective with entrepreneurs, and we used this session as a way to study it. So this is the canvas that we used, and very straightforward model. The idea is that you'd game board out different ways to think about conceptualizing a business. How many people have used the canvas, right? So all of us have had experiences. And how many of you have had positive experiences with this instrument? Yeah, about half of you, and there are deficiencies. We could co-create the canvas right now. The truth of the matter is, until we develop Saras's brain to do effectuation, this is all fantasy. It's all a series of guesses, right? The other thing that we've learned in research is that there's a stage gate process or an evolutionary process or a series of stair steps. And these are concepts that are starting to be tested, whether or not that's real, but there are really a series of choices and contingencies that occur. We've learned that from Saris, we've learned that from a number of scholars. But it occurs to me that there are certainly evolutions that ventures go through. And I've seen that same thing. I guess one thing that I know very few things, but one thing I do know, I see probably 1,000 projects a year, is I've gotten very adept at seeing patterns. And those same patterns kind of play out. So as a consequence, I know that business models adapt. Now I had to prove it. I'm not sure I've proven it yet, but I've gotten closer. The other thing that we've been curious about with the EL2 project is to what extent there's an experimental process that plays out. To what extent can we adapt the experimental cycle and the notion of hypothesis testing as a way to kind of understand it. What's curious to me is that the experimental process is stochastic. You're dealing with multiple variables on multiple levels when you're running a venture. So a single experimental process probably is likely not to be linear. It's certainly stochastic in its nature. And I'm using the term simultaneous because I think you're testing multiple things at multiple progressions in multiple ways. The thing that I've been trying to train my folks to understand is there's an intent to be rigorous. So trying to understand what specifically have you learned and then how do you adapt to something better. So can you evolve to be something better than you were? So the design we used was a simple treatment, 2 points of measurement. We applied Osterwalder's canvas in a training model. I did not train on it. A third party trained on it using the Osterwalder method. There were about 24 firms in the sample. We did 2 observations, one immediately after the training and then 2 months lagged after the training. It was a qualitative interview methodology. And these were the findings. So I'm curious to the people that have participated in using the canvas. Here's the first one. Most participating firms found some utility in the concept of the canvas. The primary benefit of the business model canvas was that it shows the interconnections between the marketing and the operational functions, the degree to which firms are outwardly facing and the degree to which they actually have internal core competencies. The primary deficiency reported by those participating in the last session of Accelerate was that in some cases it overcomplicated what they saw as simple choices, a series of choices that might relate to not only the formation of the business itself, but in many ways, I'm surprised to hear many people felt like it misrepresented what they saw as the terminus or the exit strategy of the business. In half the cases, Accelerate's companies reported that their business model had substantively changed over the period of time that we were actually working with them, suggesting a need to update the model continuously. And as you know, the model is a snapshot. Number 5, there are various inputs over time that give rise to changes in the business model. And look at the sources that gave rise to the changes that were being suggested. A change in the go-to-market strategy, considerations of expansion or going global, becoming aware of competition and first-to-market pressures, the time pressures of going into business. Then the last 2, I think, are telling. Expertise from market experts that outline feasible approaches that may have not been circumscribed initially. And lastly, insight from market experience in situ, customer feedback and pricing strategies as they engage customers. So, Patton was the one who said, all wars are won or lost at the time of first engagement. And I believe that, and I'm a student of Saris in that respect. The last piece is the business model analysis allows companies to examine alternative choices in the executional strategy of the firm. One of its best, facilities is being able to look at options, look at alternatives, different strategies. How many of you have used it in that way, looking at alternatives, right? So is there a stronger way to think about conceptualizing the business model than what you would otherwise do prima facie without having done the exercise? So the implications are manyfold. The approach to the business model analysis, I see based on this initial qualitative examination as an evolutionary process. So we could see a process to update through time with the experience of the market, and that continuous exposure to qualified market-savvy advisors will likely be an input that would result in that evolution. Secondly, tracking the evolution of the model through time to consider key inputs and changes and assumptions that drive these changes. If we could actually be rigorous enough to understand what data resulted in changes in understanding and therefore the assumptions upon which the business model was based, likely we'll be a little bit more rigorous in making these choices informed. Thirdly, clearly tie the operational marketing function of the firm to see the interrelationships in constructing the business model, but also see the impact of these choices in the system of the firm. So we're starting to see real trade-offs in the way we're designing businesses. Fourthly, to simplify the process to more clearly delineate the relationships between revenue and cost. That was one of the clear deficiencies that I saw, that it didn't as clearly equate to the economics of the firm and how those economics unfold to allow for a more clear definition of the revenue streams and cost variables that play out. So the revision that I'd like to posit to everyone here is to simplify the process, to show the interrelationships of revenue to costs, to clearly show the relationship of strategic choices to specific revenue and cost drivers, and ultimately track the evolution of the business model through time with changes brought forth by a series of key inputs that ultimately change the assumptions upon which the business model is based. So that's the challenge I kind of gave myself. And I spoke to a few entrepreneurial friends of mine, and we kind of came up with a different set of ideas. So as you know, some of my work, we talk about the business model as the logic of the firm and the financial model, looking at the economics of the firm. And I bet my students are like, holy shit, we're seeing it again. On top of the business model, aligning the human capital around it so that you have a strong leadership component, and then understanding the assets that need to be brought to bear to build the firm itself, the implementation elements, all informed by the value proposition. Well, let me take off on that for a minute. So the idea might be that you have, instead of multiple cells and lots of interrelationships, some simple value chains that play out between collaborations that you're using to get leverage on the cost side, so third parties you're bringing in to actually build the capacity of the firm, the core capacities and competencies that drive the core of the firm and what value it's producing, the third-party channels that are used to get to then end customers. You might think of that as a continuum, with the red side driving cost and the right side driving revenue. The cost side minimizing, the revenue side maximizing as a ratio of profitability. So if you think about it this way, I'm going to use this iconographic kind of approach to thinking about it. Let me play out a particular scenario. Could we just simply track revenue streams and cost streams? So think about a simple travel business that's using third-party travel agencies to do travel bundling, using discounted tickets from airlines to produce a product for the end traveler. So think about someone who's putting together an exotic trip to Austria or something of that nature. That would be a business model that would be quite typical. And you can see the revenue streams being the margins for each of the value chains and the cost elements there. Very clear and straightforward business model. And you might have those cost drivers simply listed. And then you might have hypotheses that actually back those up. You might think about a second generation business model that would look for a more rugged revenue stream that would include now working through credit card providers, a new set of revenue streams, a new set of cost variables, again, influencing the fellow traveler. Now in this particular case, the cost drivers are increased, as are the revenue stream opportunities. Now that, if you notice the right-hand side, the startup business model was the first one that I showed you right here. Now the grow-up business model might be one that gives you a greater shot at building a revenue model. And then now we could build hypotheses around that and test those. Now there might be a scale business model, and that might be the third element, where I'm trying to now disintermediate the travel agencies. I'm now trying to sell directly to the customer through these bundles, because I've already established a routine by working through credit card providers. And now it's building a new set of costs and a new set of revenue, again, probably enhancing profitability as it evolves. So that's just a simple simulation of one way we could look at simplifying the business model canvas in a way that people can understand. And guess what? The economics that play out here, 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 and here relate directly to the P&L. So it's really straightforward. It's not hard to do the math. So again, hypotheses on the third level. So I would argue that we can tie it more closely to the revenue elements of the firm, ultimately the things that are driving top line, and the things that relate to profitability, the gross profit and gross margin considerations, as well as the logic of price discovery, which ultimately are comprised of the cost of goods sold, tangible value and intangible value, and whether or not we can actually start to understand how price sensitivity is tested as a rigorous process. So I think the whole idea is maybe simplifying it a bit. So getting back to price discovery, I look at this as certainly a discovery process. So customer discovery is part of this. I do believe in the minimum viable product as a way, as a tool to test it. But my understanding will come from a much more rigorous type of testing approach, using the framework that I believe is being implemented at Accelerace extraordinarily well. So I'm quite excited about, as we now evolve our concept here, building a new understanding of how businesses look at developing their model. So there you go. These are the 4 C's. And you know I'm alliterative. I have the 5 M's, now I have the 4 C's. Maybe I'm just unimaginative, but it is a straightforward model that I hope that might make a contribution to entrepreneurs now building ventures. And we look forward to implementing it with the next round of Accelerates.